Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance, safeguarding the dream of property ownership. Tinkering around the hood of American politics. Reformers kick around ideas to improve American elections. Better maps, open primaries, more parties, ranking candidates. A roadmap to a souped-up democracy with the same clunky, beat-up sedan. Part 1, improvements or illusions?
We have some breaking news for you right now, which could have a big impact on Louisiana's congressional elections. The Associated Press reports a panel of 3 federal judges has rejected Louisiana's congressional maps with a new majority black district.
As it gets closer to election season, doesn't it seem like you hear these stories every other week? A court somewhere throws out a redistricting map. The countdown is on to this fall's election, and amazingly, the contours of state legislative seats and congressional districts still have not been settled in some states.
Tomorrow, the nation's highest court is expected to take up a case on redistricting of a South Carolina congressional district.
In some states, the Republicans do a victory dance. In another, it's the Democrats.
New York State Court just issued a ruling that could have huge political consequences for who wins control of the House of Representatives next election.
Redistricting is easily the most high-profile idea to reduce partisanship in American politics, but it's not the only one. In the next 2 episodes, we're also going to examine 3 other proposed changes to improve American democracy by bootstrapping the emergence of multiple political parties, forcing open primaries, and introducing ranked voting to boost moderate candidates. So first, on to redistricting. Let's start at the creation of our country, and let's not be naive. Scamming the redistricting maps began when George Washington was still kicking. He didn't see it coming, but some of our founding fathers rigged their congressional districts right out of the chute.
So Patrick Henry was governor of Virginia. He was an anti-federalist. James Madison was a federalist. So James Madison was going to have to run for Congress if he wanted to be able to introduce the Bill of Rights.
That's Sean O'Brien, Executive Director, Center for the Constitution.
And so his friends were saying, James, you have got to come back and campaign in your district because the district that has been drawn for you, as described by one person, as having 1,000 eccentric angles. And it was drawn to put him in the same district with James Monroe, who was an anti-federalist at the time.
The redistricting food fights begin every 10 years with the census. When my wife was 5, she tagged along with her dad at a small town in central Wisconsin, helping him do the census, ringing doorbells and watching him fill out forms. Along the way, they managed to bring a puppy home. When she couldn't figure out a name, her dad suggested, guess. So for years, she could torture anyone who asked her dog's name. She would say, guess, and then guess, and then guess, over and over. If you've ever been hit by the genealogy bug, you know the easiest records to access are U.S. Census forms now readily available online. I use them to track the social mobility of my Irish and German ancestors as they moved around Milwaukee from renters to homeowners, each address dutifully logged every 10 years. Nate Persily is at Columbia Law School.
The Constitution provides that every 10 years there is a new enumeration of the population and therefore the allocation of seats in the House of Representatives to all the states. And therefore, at the very least, those either gaining or losing seats have to redraw their maps going back some time to account for an additional seat or a loss of seat or 2.
The power to draw these new lines rests with the state legislature. And I hate to crush your idealism, but not at the top of their list was the idea to make the process fair and balanced. My one-time congressional chief of staff, Brandon Schulz, is the former executive director of the Wisconsin Republican Party, and he knows the process firsthand.
People will say that having a legislature do it is self-serving and that they have only their best interests at heart, because what redistricting is all about, no matter which side you're on, is power.
Political scientists call that gerrymandering, a term named for a little-known Boston founding father who was also rigging maps just decades after independence. Harvard political scientist Nick Stephanopoulos.
The term gerrymander comes from way back in 1812 or so. when there was a really aggressive gerrymander in my home state of Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, was linked to that effort. One of the offending districts kind of looked like a salamander. And so, some newspaper called it Gary's salamander, and that became Gerrymander, gerrymander.
For much of the history of the country, that was the name of the game. If you were in power, draw the maps that kept you in power, even made your hold on the state legislature tighter, and along the way, also grab as much power as you could in Washington, D.C. In fact, it took nearly 200 years before the Supreme Court weighed in and ended some of the most egregious practices.
Since the 1960s, the Supreme Court has shut down the process of drawing districts that had, say, 100 times more people than another. And then there are also other legal prohibitions on racial discrimination.
That's Nate again.
But when it comes to partisan greed in the process or incumbent protection, for the most part, the courts have given a green light toward incumbent politicians drawing their own lines.
So in the old days, the politicians had all the data to figure out where to draw the lines, and they could do it in the classic smoke-filled room, and nobody knew what was going on until, poof, the map showed up. And then came technology. Soon they were able to draw finer and finer lines, putting one side of a street in one district and another side of the street in a different district, all based on voting patterns. Here's Brandon again.
I think the thing that frustrates people when they see redistricting and they see the maps are these goofy maps that kind of go like this, and they put somebody's house over here, and they put their dog over here, their grandma over here. If you don't have people that are accountable and they draw lines, and the lines are just completely miserable, they're completely biased, they're just completely out of whack.
Less than 6 months after I got elected, the tug of war broke out in Washington over redistricting in Wisconsin. I'd beaten a 32-year Democratic incumbent, and the knives were out to carve out and remove Republican votes in my rural counties. Today, you can buy off-the-shelf software to draw your own map, but back then the Republican members of the congressional district had to throw money in the kitty to hire a programmer. But in the end, surprise, both parties cut a deal, and I was in the clear. It was an incumbent protection plan. Same thing New York State did after the 2020 election.
The evidence is actually a lot stronger that the Democrats, when they were drawing New York's lines, the main thing they were doing wasn't really maximizing Democratic seats. It was suppressing competition.
Here's another perspective from Nick.
A lot of seats that would have been like 52% Democratic, so like very competitive Democratic seats, were moved to make them like 57% Democratic seats. They weren't increasing the number of Democratic seats. They were just deliberately, systematically reducing competition in all those seats.
In 29 states, the old system still holds sway, with politicians in the driver's seat and citizens frozen out. Here's Amy Walter from the prestigious Cook Political Report.
Redistricting, or the way districts are drawn, is a big factor in this, right? The conventional thinking is that if politicians are drawing seats to overwhelmingly protect one party over the other, it means that there are fewer people in competitive districts, more people who sit in deeply red or deeply blue districts, and there's no incentive for them to cooperate. They don't ever have to worry about losing a general election.
But here's the good news. 21 states have created independent commissions with the goal of creating fairer maps with more competitive districts. Iowa is in many ways the national template for reform. The push began here in 1955 with the League of Women Voters and finally came to fruition in the 1980s. In Iowa, the decision is now placed in the hands of a nonpartisan legislative services agency. Jim Nussel's an old buddy from Congress, and his district was shuffled around twice during his career. I asked him to remember the night he got a look at his first new district. He said, sort of like waiting for the results of a CAT scan.
I'm breaking out in hives now just because I had just been elected. You and I were elected the same year, 1990, and that next year is when redistricting happened for both of us. And I remember, this dates us both, of course, Scott, but I remember watching a fax machine for it to go off and for the paper to roll out and a printed copy of what the map looked like of what my new district was going to be in Iowa. And it was very different from where it was. And it threw me in to a district with a very seasoned Democratic member of the congressional delegation.
A decade later, his district was again upended.
And I felt both during the process and afterwards, and then having the opportunity to watch others go through the Iowa process, that it was abundantly fair. It was really unassailable in its fairness. It was difficult to find any chink in the armor.
Ironically, while the Republicans were dead set against the curation of the system, it served them pretty well. The congressional delegation today is all Republican, but the most important factor is really the rightward shift of the state. The model has worked well in Iowa, but it really wouldn't work well in many other places. Here's longtime Des Moines Register columnist David Yepsen.
Iowa is a small state. Iowa is a box-shaped state. And Iowa is 96% white. Is this really a good template for other states? And secondly, it's been explained to me by people in larger states that the political culture in each state really decides this. In Iowa, these districts are 4 times smaller than they are in other states, or 5 times. The most important factor in winning a legislative race in Iowa is a good candidate, somebody the locals all know. But in big states, the most important factor is partisan registration.
The challenges are most acute in states with large Black and Latino populations. There's a tension between creating a compact minority-majority district, which oftentimes makes the state's remaining districts whiter and more likely Republican. It's led to some really crazy maps.
The most infamous was, I think, North Carolina's 12th district in the 90s. This was like a snake-like district that basically went through all of North Carolina's cities in the center of the state, picking up the heavily Black neighborhoods in those cities.
Nick Stephanopoulos again.
You know, the important thing is you could have drawn a much more reasonable looking Black majority district, but it wouldn't have served all of the line drawers' other goals. You know, you couldn't draw a normal looking Black majority district and preserve all of the existing Democratic incumbents in North Carolina.
Oftentimes, politicians wrap themselves in the American flag, rallying at partisan abuses in redistricting. Former Obama Attorney General Eric Holder frequently visited Wisconsin because of what he saw as an unfair Republican map. While he never quite managed to stop in Illinois, the state right next door. He might want to talk to Stephanopoulos.
Illinois is just as aggressive in Democrats' favor. Ugly, sprawling districts that go from Chicago to halfway across the state. And you turn what's maybe like a 57, 58% Democratic state into one where Democrats have like 80% of the congressional districts.
Let's be clear that the Reformers Commissions are far from perfect. Take Washington State. In 1983, it was the 3rd state to set up an independent commission. Unlike Iowa, which is handled by technocrats, this one has 2 Republican legislators, 2 Democratic legislators, and a neutral chair. Through several redistricting cycles, Washington's commission worked smoothly, praised as a national model for how to fix the process of drawing lines. But in November of 2021, it all went to hell. The commission had argued for weeks without agreeing on a fair map. With 5 hours to go to meet a hard legal deadline, they gathered for a final public meeting with live-streamed updates. When the meeting began, the commission's new logo filled the screen. It boldly proclaimed, "Draw your Washington." The chairwoman, Sarah Augustine, immediately announced the 4 other members, the 2 Democrats and the 2 Republicans, wanted to caucus privately. She promised regular updates. And now on the screen, a new slide slid into prominence. "Meeting on break," it flashed. Augustine, who got the job because she had a master's degree in conflict resolution, perhaps should have taken a crapload of more classes. Every half hour, a staffer briefly came on camera to inform viewers that the caucuses continued. An interpreter even signed for deaf viewers. It was all a charade. The Republicans and the Democrats weren't even in the building. They were in a hotel 40 minutes away, down the street cutting a deal the old-fashioned way. It was a blatant violation of the rules. And in those hotel rooms, Democrats and Republicans were talking to their leadership, and they both had one goal: commission or no commission, protect the incumbents. Marilyn Thompson broke the story for ProPublica. Here she is on Oregon Public Radio.
Yeah, it was actually pretty shocking for me because, as you say, it's supposed to be working independently, coming to independent decisions. But right up until the very last moments, the members of the commission were in touch and trading text messages with people in the legislature who would be directly impacted by the plan. And that's really been the problem in recent years. A couple of these commissions have just fallen on their face trying to get the basic job done. And when you start peeling away the layers, what you see is the same kind of petty politics that we've been hearing about in legislatures forever.
In 2021, 5 states with independent commission faced lawsuits over their maps. If you're a regular listener to my podcast, you know cynicism runs deep. Remember, I've been a journalist, a politician, and a lobbyist. I'm not surprised in the least that politicians were trying to game the system, but the evidence is pretty clear. The biggest abusers are the states that still leave it in the hands of the politicians.
If you look at a bunch of states, you find all sorts of intentional, pretty extreme gerrymanders. So, Democratic maps in Illinois or Oregon or New Mexico, Republican maps in Florida or in Georgia or in Tennessee. There are all sorts of bad state-specific gerrymanders right now.
Here's Nick one more time.
Nationwide, if you look in aggregate, I'm a little bit less concerned with gerrymandering now than I was a decade ago, just because in the current cycle, it's balanced out more on a nationwide sort of aggregate basis. So if you look at the U.S. House as a whole right now, I don't think it's significantly skewed in either party's favor by gerrymandering.
National columnist Bill Kristol, who you likely know from TV, agrees that the commissions are an improvement. But given the level of rancor in Congress, he doesn't think it solved the underlying partisanship.
Is due to the socioeconomic trends that have separated the parties so much and put people in safe districts and so forth, red and blue America, probably more than gerrymandering. We had gerrymandering when you were elected to the House, and some of that can be fixed or partly fixed with some of these electoral changes and sort of technical changes, but it obviously goes deeper than that. Now, whether, Iowa has and other states have, nonpartisan districting, the courts do it or independent bodies do it. I don't know if their politics are much healthier.
Jim Nussel, even with his head on the chopping block twice, does buy in.
We are desperately seeking in our country today an opportunity to provide more of this kind of political fairness. And the two parties in both of their instances where they have power are controlling it as much as they possibly can. They're holding on to it with a death grip in many instances, and they're desperately trying to rig the system, both sides, to try and expand that power.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. Our country recognizes homeownership as one of the best ways to build wealth and stable communities. But over the years, support for homeownership has dwindled, and our leaders have lost sight of its value. We're working to change that. The American Property Owners Alliance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that holds our leaders accountable to safeguard homeowners and communities. Visit propertyownersalliance.org to learn more and find out how you can join our efforts.
As the country's self-proclaimed champion of America's bewildered political orphans, I often get asked, why don't we have more political parties? Well, we actually do. The Libertarians and the Greens have a presence in just about every state in the country. So does the Constitution Party. But they don't win anything. Johns Hopkins Lee Drutman, who also is a contributor to the 535 website, says we have to change that. Too many Americans aren't buying what the Republicans or the Democrats are selling.
Well, it's not just third parties, but it's third, fourth, fifth parties. The basic idea is that the U.S. is a tremendous outlier. The U.S. is really the only advanced democracy in the world with just a two-party system.
He concedes the system worked well for 2 centuries, but not really anymore.
This two-party system worked reasonably well for a while in the U.S. because it actually wasn't really a two-party system. It was a lot of overlapping coalitions within the loose affiliations of a two-party system. And for a while, it was something like a four-party system with liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats alongside conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. And really over the last 2 decades or so, we are living in a radically different two-party system, one that's fully sorted, one in which there's very little overlap, and one in which there's narrow balance for power, and one in which partisan animosity and hostility have both grown tremendously in this, what I've called a two-party doom loop of escalating hyperpartisanship.
So how would he change that system? First, he'd make every House seat in the country bigger. So instead of having 435 members of Congress, we might have 600. Let's use his home state of Massachusetts as ground zero. Rather than 9 districts, he'd have 5. Right now, the Democrats control all 9 of them. The Republicans are frozen out.
I mean, the main barrier to third and fourth and fifth parties is our voting system of single winner elections. When you can only have one winner, a vote for a third party is a wasted vote, a spoiled vote. And so all of the energy, all of the organizing, all of the money goes into the 2 top parties, the 2 parties that have a chance of winning.
In his plan, there'd be proportional representation. So if 5 candidates from 5 different parties in a district each get 20%, they'd each get a seat in the U.S. House. One evidence that it works, look towards Western Europe. In a survey of voter satisfaction with the political system, the U.S. is way towards the bottom. Places like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands all score much higher than the U.S.
And there's a growing body of comparative political science literature that shows that in countries with multiple parties and reasonably fluid coalitions in which the governing party and the ruling parties tend to shift from election to election, there's not the same level of partisan hatred. And the reason for that is because different parties have been in coalition with other parties. So people say, oh, well, we've been in coalition with them, so they're not so bad, or we've been in opposition with them. Oh, they're not so bad. In a similar way in which we had something more like coalition government in the past with Democrats and Republicans working with each other. And it used to be that when you, maybe you even remember this, when you ran for Congress, actually saying, I get things done in a bipartisan way was actually a selling point as opposed to a stain on your courage and honesty and purity.
The kind of most direct thing that people think of that are beneficial to multi-party democracies is that you have more choice.
That's Sam Rosenfeld. He's a professor at Colgate.
There's good evidence to show that proportional representation, multi-party systems tend to generate more stable, consensus-oriented, and responsive government. And in some ways, that's kind of might be surprising because what you get with multi-party systems are more finely tuned ideological expressions, including ideologies that are quite non-centrist. But the process of needing to form coalitions in government as a matter of routine, as a kind of built-in part of the system, tends to inculcate norms of coalition making, kind of incremental change and consensus. That if I had an Etch-a-Sketch and could just completely make the American constitutional order disappear, I would be all for implementing here in the United States.
Okay. Let's hit the brakes here. Here's a fun fact to keep in mind. First, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium all have monarchs, And so do Andorra, Liechtenstein, and Monaco. Last time I checked, I think we had a war over that issue. And King George in the hit musical Hamilton, though he did predict one day that we would be back.
You'll be back, soon you'll see. You remember you belong to me. You'll be back, time will tell. You remember that I served you well. Oceans rise.
And while the Scandinavian countries, you could argue, are a little bit of heaven, trust me, the UK elections are not exactly without partisanship. Here's a clip from a debate with all 7 major parties in the UK in early June, and trust me, they were all at each other's throat.
They are going to put up your taxes by £2,000.
That's a lie.
By £2,000 per working household.
Penny, your government have raised taxes to the record level in 70 years.
The last
we
Parliament,
have,
and we've hated putting taxes up.
You're using a figure that's been criticised by the UK Statistics Watch.
Well, that went on for about 90 minutes. And while there were 7 parties on stage, the 2 major parties, the Conservatives and Labour, have 85% of the seats in Parliament. The Greens have 1. Others represent Wales and Scotland and are really not national players. I will concede the Nordic countries have an impressive track record of stability, but multi-party democracy can also lead to chaos. Think of Italy and Israel.
Now, there's political uncertainty in Italy after the Prime Minister Mario Draghi offered his resignation, only to have it rejected by the president.
All right, Israel is heading for yet another national election. It's 4th in 2 years.
Dan Hiller is a political blogger on Medium and a multi-party skeptic.
Look at Israel, Italy, sometimes England goes in and out of this, that as soon as you have really serious, important issues to come up, if you need to pass legislation, and the only way to do it is to get the cooperation of a very small third party in order to tip you over, well, you're going to have to give them something. And whatever that is, I guarantee you it's not something the majority of the country wants.
Put Bill Kristol in that same column.
I don't think we're going to have fundamental changes that will undercut the 2 parties that are pretty historically well established. So I'm not against trying them after this election, and someone wants to start a centrist third party, I might sign up for it. But you're not trying to wave some magic wand and suddenly turn us into, a European country that has a parliamentary system. We have individual districts. We have first past the post. Once you have those 2 things, you have a pretty big incentive to go towards 2 parties.
So it gets hard for me to figure out exactly how a multi-party system would improve things. Adding small numbers of libertarians, Greens, progressives, seems to me you get a more fractured country that's even harder to govern. And that's just what we need, a more fractured country. Seems like an intriguing idea in the halls of academia, but I'm not sure it really plays in the Bronx. Next time on Lost in the Middle, 2 reforms trying to build in a tilt towards moderate candidates. Ranked voting, a reform already in play in Alaska, Maine, New York City, and San Francisco. And open primaries, allowing independents to help choose major party candidates. And in the meantime, sorry, King George, I don't think we're coming back.
You'll be back like before. I will fight the fight and win the war for your love, for your praise, and I'll love you till my dying day.
Here's the team behind Lost in the Middle. Executive producer Jeff Mayers. Producer Todd Elbaugh. Creative team Claudia Luz and Tony Wood. Edited by Aaron Zummers. Music by Brett William. Production at Civic Media. And a quick thanks to our partners at the American Property Owners Alliance.
To remind you of my love.
If you like this episode of Lost in the Middle, please remember to subscribe to our podcast. And if you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and pals.